Skaven are run-of-the-mill sword-wielding monsters who prove to be little more than cannon fodder. While they have relatively high attack power in Battle 4, their damage will quickly become negligible over the next couple of battles as our character's defense stat rises. Snipers are the first ranged combat unit we encounter in Shining Force 3. Their high attack power and ability to attack at a distance makes them more difficult to predict and more dangerous to our weaker characters. They possess a surprisingly high defense rating and do not perish as easily as we'd like. Worms are unpleasant creatures with high hit points and solid attack and defense ratings. They have the ability to paralyze their targets, preventing them from taking actions. They are vulnerable to caster weapons, which won't help us very much, but can be easily outmaneuvered due to their slow movement speed. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Let's Play Shining Force 3. My name is TotalBiscuit, and this is the Dwarf Valley. It's Battle 4. Now, there are a number of interesting elements to this fight, and I'm going to be explaining them as the fight goes along. What we're about to see is a treasure chest, and you can find these on certain battlefields. You know, we've seen them in the exploration section, we now see them here. You have to go up to them with one of your characters and use an action to open it. It contains a very nice item. We're not going to be missing out on it. However, it's not the primary focus of this particular fight. This fight has a new mechanic which allows for the respawning of enemies, and particularly those enemies are the worms and the Skaven, which were explained in the bestiary earlier. Now, they can respawn from that stone at the top right-hand corner there, and they will continue to do so throughout the fight if you kill them. What that means is you can't actually kill everything to win the fight. What we're going to have to do in order to win the fight is to actually cross the Dwarf Valley and get to the other side. Now, what this fight allows is a rather unique opportunity. It allows us to do a little bit of power leveling. Now, normally this is something that I don't do in the game because there really is absolutely no reason to. The game is relatively well balanced. It's always pretty challenging without being overly so. It doesn't really get too easy at any point, and if you do have any level deficiencies towards the end of the game, you can sort those out by going into the Heroes Test Dungeon, which is the penultimate fight. And there's one of those at the end of every scenario. Very nice piece of forward planning there by Camelot. They obviously knew what potential problem could be. Now, here's something new for you. Our character is about to learn the first of 4 potential special moves, and I'm going to explain what these mean in this educational video. Special attacks can be used by both allies and enemies, and as well as dealing extra damage, often have a variety of secondary effects. These abilities cannot be activated at will, rather are based on a proc chance that can be affected by various different conditions and stats. Each ally is capable of learning 3 special attacks, which will come as their proficiency with their weapon increases. A 4th special attack may be gained if the character is using a particularly powerful weapon, which gives them that ability. The use of special attacks does not cost mana, and they can theoretically be used as often as a character wishes in battle, with emphasis on the wishes of the character, not the player. And there you have it. That's a brief explanation of the special attack system. And yeah, some people think it's a bit random. Some people like the look element of it. Personally, I quite like the look element of it. I think it's quite cool, and it can do some really nice turnarounds in battle, for good or ill. Now, the guys up here are not pushovers like the mass monks that we encountered earlier. They have left the bats in there just to be irritating, but I'm going to show you here the benefit of the secondary weapon that we picked up in town, and that's the bronze knife. There are a number of different knives in the game, and we'll be getting the best ones possible for Kite, as well as spears for Dantes, and there's a few other ranged weapons that we can get for some of our more melee-centric characters. Now, yeah, the bats are still here, and they are irritating, to say the least. They poison, and we've seen how the poison works. They're a mild annoyance, but they kept them in there just for the poison element. Now, you saw earlier we blew up a couple of barrels, and they actually contained a lot of antidotes. Now, the reason they do that is because the worms that we're going to be seeing a little bit later on actually have a paralysis ability, which can also be cured by the antidote herb. So we've got poison and we've got paralysis, and it turns into a glorious mess of horrible. Now, we're going down the middle with the rest of our party, and what we're going to be doing is we're going to be sending Obright, who has a surprisingly high movement speed, over to the left-hand side and up the hill. He's got a lot of defense, which means he can move past the enemies with relative ease, and he can pick up what's in that treasure chest. Now, in the meantime, we're going to be moving towards the end, clearing the way, so that when we finally decide to leave the level, we can do that. Dantes is doing quite a bit of damage right now, and will continue to do an awful lot more as we utilize the friendship bonus that we've gained between Kite and Dantes, and that's the reason I've sent them up there, more so than actually getting experience and leveling up. I want them to gain more friendship. There's a friendship bonus there called Succumb, which I explained earlier. It actually gives the ability to resist the possibility of critical hits and special attacks from enemies. Alright, I'm going to be skipping forward in a little bit because we're trying to show the relevant and more interesting parts of this particular fight. O'Bright is heading over to the left-hand side to see what he can do about grabbing what's in that treasure chest. Now, we're going to see something here called the Paralyze Attack. This is the second status effect that we encounter in Shining Force 3, and aside from making our hero look incredibly retarded, it is an attack which can potentially cancel out an action that you would have otherwise been able to take. So in other words, if you have Paralyze on you and you attempt to use an item, cast a spell, or do a physical attack or whatever, there is a chance that that will not happen. You can still move, which is kind of weird. It doesn't really make an awful lot of sense, but you can still move while you're paralyzed without any problems or impediments whatsoever. In the meantime, we're going to be sending our guys down the middle, and we're going to clear the way out. Now, these Skaven here are not particularly dangerous, and we don't see them all that often. Indeed, they do so little damage that they're relatively negligible. On the other hand, the worms and the snipers we will be seeing, a couple of times in later fights, and they continue to be relatively dangerous, particularly to our lower defense characters. You saw there the stats page that comes up briefly when you switch weapons and your equipment. Equipment management is pretty easy in this game. There's nothing particularly exciting about it, and it demonstrates that the knife has a lower attack rating than the sword, and that will continue to be the case. Even when we get our best knife, it's going to have a lower attack rating than our best sword, and that's just the way that it works. All the secondary weapons work that way, and we'll see a few of those later on. Now, here's the sniper, and the sniper can do, as you're about to see, quite a bit of damage. It's actually our first ranged enemy that we encountered, and by ranged I mean specifically a physical ranged enemy rather than a spellcaster. And that means that whereas melee AI specifically goes for our main hero, the ranged AI doesn't necessarily have to do that. It will do that when it gets the opportunity, but it will often fire past our main hero and hit someone that's rather more vulnerable. So placement is important, as it is in any tactical battle RPG, and particularly when we deal with these ranged enemies, and some of them later on will actually gain a range of 3 squares rather than 2, which makes them even more lethal, and we really have to watch out with them. There's a respawning enemy. They will continue to do that throughout the fight, which makes it useful for power leveling, but rather annoying if you're going to be staying up there for too long. We're not going to keep Dantes and Kite up there for too much longer. They don't have any healers, and I don't want to burn through too many consumables, so we'll get them maybe a level each, and then we'll move on from there. Okay, it's about time we see O'Bright in action. Now, O'Bright's attack power, at least at this point in the game, is not particularly high, although, it's not particularly fair putting him against someone with incredibly high defense in the case of the Worm. But what he does have, two particular advantages, is he's got a very high movement speed for an infantry unit, and he's also got a very high defense, which means that he can take an awful lot of hits, and you can use him effectively as a bait and tank unit, which we will later on, and thankfully, certainly once he gets promoted and learns some special attacks, he gets some great stuff. Quality example of the friendship system in action, a sickening amount of overkill, and we're just going to skip ahead a little bit here to show you one of the special attacks. Now, this is called Lance Charge. It's the first of 4 special attacks. Prepare to die. And a stellar example there of the amazing voice acting in this game. Trust me, you're going to get an awful lot worse later on. We're going to skip ahead now again to show O'Bright grabbing the contents of that chest and is going to be running down past a gauntlet of enemies. It's not really a big problem because, as I said, he can take an awful lot of hits, but it's about time that we scarper out of here. We're running low on consumables and I don't want to waste anything that's particularly valuable. Okay, what you're about to see here is the effects of status effects stacking up one on top of each other, and they can do that if they happen to be different kinds of status effects. Now, the problem with that, particularly at this level, is that if you get status effects stacked up, the only thing we've got to get rid of them right now is the antidote herb. And the antidote herb will only remove 1 per use. It's the equivalent of an antidote level 1 spell, which we'll get later on in the game. but we don't have it right now. So yeah, it's not the ideal situation by any stretch of the imagination. So we're going to get Obra out of there, and you saw down at the bottom there the Steel Bracer. The Steel Bracer is the counterpart to the Iron Bracer that we received at the end of Battle 2. It increases defense, and we'll work out who we're going to give it to a little bit later on. We'll probably hand it over to Kite, and then give the Attack Bracer that we got over to either Dantes or Hayward as our primary damage characters. Now, Mascarin learned Blaze level 2, and you see there was an AoE effect there. We're kind of wasting mana here. There's no reason whatsoever to use a Blaze level 2 on one target, because it barely does any more damage to a single target. What it does do is hit everyone around him. Incredibly useful, very efficient if you end up using it on more than one or two monsters at any particular time. Now, as we move through the valley here, I'd like to just say a little bit about this actual level. Funnily enough, this level was part of a beta build of Shining Force 3, which was released in 1997. It was a prototype, and the idea was to actually test the market, test the water, if you will, for the release of this particular game. Now, there was a level that was cut, which was actually known as Dwarf Valley Beta, and it was the original version of this. It was nothing like this whatsoever. It's actually ended up being a prototype for a much later battle involving a waterfall and a suspension bridge. Now, that is absolutely nothing like this, as you can imagine. There was a couple of interesting differences, including the fact that Kite, the main character, didn't have his return magic, so there was no way to actually get back to the church for saving at any point. And thankfully, I must say, most of the characters didn't have any voice acting. Of course, the Japanese version, and particularly, has better voice acting. Not that you can understand any of it, but at least it's not vomit-worthy as the voice acting in the English translation is. Thankfully, we won't be affected by that too much in scenarios 2 and 3. Now, we're moving towards the end of this particular level now, and you've seen the characters earlier trying to map move, and that's actually a piece of functionality we'll see used later on once we encounter the Ruin, which we're going to see in the next battle, and that allows you to move from battlefield to battlefield. In this case, we can't actually do that until our leader gets to the end of the battlefield. He's the one who gets to move, he's the one who gets to end the fight, and he's about to do that right now. This has been Battle 4 in Dwarf Valley. My name has been TotalBiscuit, and this has been Let's Play Shining Force 3. I'll see you next time.